Paris, late February 2026. Inside the gilded walls of l'Olympia, the crowd falls quiet as a name is called that no one expected to hear in France that night. A man walks out with hair falling loose to his shoulders, a face fuller and softer than the one audiences memorized for 4 decades, and for a moment, nobody in the room seems entirely sure it is really him. Then he smiles, and the room exhales. It is Jim Carrey, accepting an honorary César Award, and it is, by his own account, only the first time the world has seen him in public that year. What happens in the minutes that follow? A tribute to a father long buried, a plea from a friend not to disappear, a joke that lands like confession, will end up being read by millions as a quiet, dignified answer to a question that has hung over his career for 4 years. Is Jim Carrey really done? To understand why that question carries so much weight, you have to go back to where the performance first became a matter of survival rather than ambition. Jim Carrey was born in January 1962 in Newmarket, Ontario, the youngest of 4 children in a house where love was constant but money rarely was. His father, Percy, had once dreamed of a life playing saxophone in dance halls before settling for the steadier, quieter life of an accountant. Carrey has described his father as a man with real artistic talent who spent most of his adult life behind a desk instead. A compromise, Carrey has said, he watched way on a more with every passing year. When the plant where Percy worked eventually shut its doors, the family stability went with it. For a stretch of Carrey's adolescence, his parents and siblings took whatever work they could find, including night shift factory jobs, just to keep the household afloat, and the family endured a period of real financial hardship that Carrey has referenced candidly in interviews across his career. He has said that watching his father lose his job and his sense of purpose taught him early that hard work was never a guarantee of anything, and that lesson, delivered in childhood, never fully left him. It shaped, in his own telling, the relentless work ethic that would later define, and at times exhaust his adult career. Comedy, for the young Carrey, was never simply ambition. He has described it as the one tool he had to keep his family's spirits from collapsing entirely during those difficult years, a way of turning a house full of worry into a house that could still laugh at itself for a few minutes at a time. By his teenage years, he was already performing at Toronto's Yuck Yucks Comedy Club, developing the elastic, almost cartoonish physical style that would eventually define him on screens around the world. He auditioned for Saturday Night Live and was turned away, a rejection he has referenced candidly in later interviews as one of the more formative disappointments of his young career. Rather than break him, it pushed him to stop chasing someone else's format and start building his own strange, specific characters, an instinct that would eventually become his signature. That gamble paid off when Rodney Dangerfield invited him onto his national tour in the early 1980s. Giving Carrey his first real exposure to large audiences and a taste of the discipline required to hold a room's attention night after night. It paid off again in 1990 when he joined the Fox sketch series In Living Color, where his elastic-faced characters, most memorably the unsettling Fire Marshal Bill, made him one of the show's most talked-about performers and gave American audiences their first real sense of what he was capable of. Then came 1994, the year that changed everything. Ace Ventura, pet detective turned a modest, almost throwaway premise into a cultural phenomenon, and alongside The Mask and Dumb and Dumber, gave Carrey 3 enormous hits in a single calendar year, a run that remains one of the most remarkable in modern comedy history, and instantly made him one of the most bankable stars in the world. He became, almost overnight, a name studios were desperate to sign, commanding paychecks that climbed rapidly within just a couple of years. But fame arriving at that speed rarely comes without cost, and Carrey has spoken candidly, in interviews stretching from the 1990s to the present day, about the toll that period took on him personally and on the people closest to him. His first marriage, to Melissa Womer, whom he met on the set of the Duck Factory years before he became famous, ended in the mid-1990s, and Carrey has acknowledged in retrospective conversations that the sudden, overwhelming scale of his stardom made it difficult to hold on to the ordinary life he'd had before it. A second marriage, to actress Lauren Holly, followed a similar arc, ending after roughly a year, with Carrey later reflecting that he struggled during that period to stay emotionally present with the people around him even as his career reached new heights. It was in the years that followed that Carrey began deliberately reshaping what people expected of him, moving away from pure comedy toward roles that carried real emotional weight. The Truman Show, released in 1998, cast him as a man who discovers his entire life has been staged for the entertainment of others, a premise that, watch again decades later, feels almost eerily self-referential given how much of Carrey's own life had already played out under the lens of public performance. Director Peter would push him through grueling physical sequences, including an elaborate storm scene shot inside an enormous artificial ocean tank built specifically for production, and the result was widely regarded as the moment critics stopped viewing Carrey purely as a comedian and started taking him seriously as a dramatic actor. He won a Golden Globe for performance, a recognition that marked a genuine turning point in how Hollywood saw him. He followed it with Man on the Moon, his portrayal of comedian Andy Kaufman, a role he immersed himself in so completely that people on set reported he rarely broke character even when the cameras weren't rolling. Years later, the Netflix documentary Jim and Andy, The Great Beyond, directed by Chris Smith and released in 2017, used behind-the-scenes footage from that production to show just how far Carrey had gone in blurring the line between himself and the character. Footage the production had kept largely unseen for nearly 2 decades before its eventual release, and which many critics described as some of the most unguarded material ever captured of a major star at work. By the time he made Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind in 2004, Carrey had built a reputation for the kind of total immersion that left him genuinely changed by the roles he took on. He has said in interviews that the film's exploration of memory, loss, and identity affected him more personally than almost anything else he had made, and that shedding his usual comedic instincts for a quieter, more vulnerable performance came at a real emotional cost that took time to recover from. It was around this period, and increasingly in the years that followed, that Carrey began speaking more openly about his long history with depression. He has discussed in multiple interviews over the years, having relied on antidepressant medication for extended periods of his adult life, framing his own comedic energy as something built, at least in part, over a foundation of genuine sadness he rarely let audiences see. That honesty reframed, for many longtime fans, the manic energy of his earlier work. The same face that made millions laugh had spent decades quietly working through real and persistent pain. Something has since said he eventually chose to face without medication, preferring, in his words, to feel the difficult emotions rather than numb them entirely. That contradiction, the world's most kinetic comedian carrying one of its more publicly discussed struggles with depression, became, in a strange way, the thread that ties his entire career together. It is there in the poverty of his childhood, in the desperate reinvention after his SNL rejections, in the manic physical toll of In Living Color, in the identity dissolution of Man on the Moon, and in his later, quieter turn toward philosophy and spirituality. His personal life during this stretch was not without controversy either. In 2015, his former girlfriend Katrina White died, and a lawsuit was subsequently filed by her family that made serious allegations against Carrey, which he denied through his legal team. The case was ultimately dismissed in 2018, though it remained a difficult and painful chapter that Carrey has rarely discussed publicly in detail since. Around 2017, in the years surrounding that period, Carrey began speaking at length, including in a widely circulated Fashion Week interview, about having moved away from valuing fame or personal identity altogether, describing an interest in ideas associated with the spiritual writer Eckhart Tolle, and a growing sense that peace for him existed somewhere entirely outside of public recognition. He began painting extensively during this period as well, producing work he described as an outlet distinct from performing, a way of processing emotion without an audience watching or applauding. All of which brings the story to April 2022, when Carrey sat down for an interview with Access Hollywood while promoting Sonic the Hedgehog 2 and said, in terms that made headlines around the world, that he was planning to retire from acting. He told the outlet he was fairly serious about the decision, adding that he felt he had done enough and reached a point where he no longer needed to prove anything through the work. It read at the time like a clean and dignified exit, the culmination of everything he had said in prior years about stepping back from ego and performance. He suggested almost playfully that he might only return if the angels brought him a script written in gold ink, a phrase that stuck in the public imagination precisely because it sounded like something only Jim Carrey would say. Except it did not stay that clean. In 2024, Carrey returned to the role of Dr. Robotnik for Sonic the Hedgehog 3, a decision that immediately reopened the question of what his 2022 comments had actually meant. Pressed on the apparent contradiction, he told outlets, including in comments reported around the film's press run, that his earlier statement had amounted to hyperbole, and that what he had really meant by retirement was closer to what he called power resting, stepping back from the constant churn of the industry, rather than closing the door forever. At the London premiere of the film, he offered a version of the same idea in a single, almost shrugging line, telling press that you cannot be definite about these things, because a good idea or the right people can always change your mind. It was, in effect, Carrey publicly admitting that the boundary between retirement and simply choosing his moments had never been as fixed as his earlier declaration made it sound. Reports at the time even noted, half-jokingly, that the Sonic 3 filmmakers had gone as far as printing his script in gold ink to help persuade him back, a callback to his own 2022 joke that Carrey later confirmed had genuinely moved him. Since then, his public life has narrowed dramatically. Where Carrey once seemed to be everywhere, talk shows, award ceremonies, viral red carpet moments, he has instead become one of Hollywood's rarest sightings, stepping into view for only a handful of occasions across 2025 and into 2026. Friends and collaborators have noted that this scarcity appears to be intentional rather than circumstantial. Carrey has said in past interviews that he values, in his own words, getting out of people's faces, adding that some public figures want constant visibility, while he prefers to give audiences room to miss him. That preference is precisely what made the César Awards appearance in February 2026 feel so significant. It marked his first public appearance of the year, and by several accounts his first in months, and it arrived wrapped in a strikingly different image. Hair worn long, his face visibly changed, enough that social media reaction to days that followed repeatedly used the word unrecognizable. He was introduced that night by Michel Gondry, the director who had guided him to eternal sunshine of the spotless mind more than 2 decades earlier, and by his own account, he grew visibly emotional as Gondry recalled their work together. He used part of his acceptance speech, delivered partly in French, to honor his late father, Percy, describing him as the funniest man he had ever known and crediting him with teaching him that generosity and laughter mattered more than anything else life could take away. He shared one of his father's own sayings about needing to smile at fortune before fortune ever smiles back, a lesson he said remains difficult to live by but worth the effort. In that same ceremony, Emmanuel Curtil, the actor who has voiced Carrey's roles for French-speaking audiences for decades, publicly urged him not to leave the profession, a moment that, watch back, plays less like fan service and more like a friend genuinely unsure whether he was watching a celebration or farewell. That uncertainty is, in many ways, the most honest way to describe where Jim Carrey's career actually stands today. He is not gone, and he has not announced any final, irreversible decision. His own history shows how quickly a firm declaration from him can soften into something more provisional. But something in that Paris appearance felt different from the usual rhythm of celebrity comebacks and reversals. It felt, to many who watched it, like a man closing a loop rather than opening a new chapter. Paying tribute to a father whose lost job and quiet disappointment had once pushed a frightened teenager toward comedy in the first place, standing in a country that had just called him one of the most original voices in modern cinema, and doing it all with a face and a presence that looked, quite literally, like someone else's version of Jim Carrey. Whether or not another film role ever materializes, the shape of his own words over the last several years suggests where his priorities have already shifted. He has spoken since at least the late 2010s about wanting distance from ego and fame, about painting instead of performing, about therapy and honesty replacing the exhausting work of pretending. He has said, in one of his more quoted reflections, that people should get everything they ever dreamed of, simply so they can discover firsthand that it was never the answer. For a man who spent decades convincing the world he was fine by making it laugh, that may be the closest thing to a real goodbye he has ever offered. Not in any ounce of fanfare, but a slow, deliberate turning away from the spotlight toward whatever quieter peace he has spent the last decade trying to build for himself. And if that César Award night in Paris really was the last time the cameras catch him standing on a stage built for someone else's applause, it will have been, fittingly, a goodbye delivered not with a punchline, but with a tribute to a man who taught him, in the hardest years of his life, that laughter was worth more than anything money could ever buy.